Hello everyone, today we're going to be doing the first chapter of the Theologia Moralis by St. Alphonsus Liguori. This is from his first treatise on conscience, chapter 1. What is conscience, how manifold is it, and what must be followed? We have some preliminaries first. Why would I make such a long, weird video? The purpose of this is to be useful for Catholics. It will be a publicly available reference for anyone who's looking for specific explanations on things like what conscience is, what scrupulosity is, what vincible and invincible ignorance are. Useful for anyone interested in Catholic understandings of morality, and it's useful for, well, the necessity of understanding conscience. Conscience is not like Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio. What happened to the other morality video on the channel? I deleted it. I was going to do another moral manual by a Jesuit, but I thought this would be much better and more useful, so I deleted that, and I'm going to do this series for now. And finally, this book is made for priests, so a lot of the stuff in here is directed at priests. However, you can apply much of the advice to your own life. This is the order of the chapter with each part in it. I'm not going to read all of these off, but this is the order of everything we're going to be doing. So you can pause it and look through to see if anything interests you. Okay, first, on the remote and proximate rule of human acts. The remote law is the divine law. This is the law laid down by God and nature. It's absolute. It tells you what actions are good and which are evil. Then we have the proximate law, which is conscience. The conscience is how you have access to the divine and natural law. The conscience ought to conform to the divine law. The goodness of an action is measured by the will, and the will can only act upon what is in the intellect. This is to say that you can only take action on knowledge. You can't try to do something without knowing what you're doing. Okay. Next, we have on conscience and synderesis. Conscience is a judgment of practical reason in which we judge something must be done here and now as good, or something must be avoided as evil. This is not some vague feeling about liking or not liking something. This is not Jiminy Cricket. This is an actual judgment of reason. There are reasons why you choose this action, and it's imperative that you follow it. Yeah. Then we have synderesis. This is speculative knowledge of universal principles to live well. This is what we're doing. The scholastics would call this like scientific knowledge of morality. Like you understand the first principles and then you apply them to specific complicated situations. Okay. On a right and erroneous conscience. Right conscience is a conscience which dictates the truth. Erroneous conscience is a conscience which dictates error, as if it were truth. And then there are two kinds of erroneous conscience. One is vincible, which means that it's a conscience which should know better but doesn't. And one is invincible, which is a conscience which could know better if it was given more information, but has no access to that information. So a vincible conscience notices an error or notices an obligation to conquer an error, but fails to do so. It's only necessary to make a common effort to overcome an error if you're trying to avoid sin. So if you don't want to sin, you just have to make a normal-sized effort to overcome the sin. You don't have to become a scholar to figure out that one course of action is better than another. And then for invincible ignorance or error, no thought or doubt of error ever enters the mind, or even confusion while the action takes place. You just have no idea that you should be taking a different course of action. Okay, next, on someone who follows a vincibly erroneous conscience. Someone who acts according to an erroneous conscience always sins. They act according either to a vincible error that they know that they should conquer, So either they act according to an error that they should know better about, and they know they should know better, or they go against what their conscience judges to be good. And because conscience is the proximate law, you should never do that. So regardless of which way you act, if you have a vincibly erroneous conscience, you'll be in sin. All of this assumes that the person has not made a requisite attempt to overcome their error before they act. So if you notice that you might be in error and you make an attempt to overcome the error, a common attempt, not a scholarly attempt, then you will not be in sin when you take an action. On someone who follows an invincibly erroneous conscience. Not only do they not sin in following their conscience, but they are bound to follow it. The reason for this is because conscience is the proximate rule of action. It tells you what is good and what is evil, and you have to follow it because of that. If you have no reason to think your conscience is wrong, then you must follow it because it's what you believe will lead you closer to God. It's what you genuinely believe is the best course of action. And intentionally going against that is evil in itself. Whether working in such a way, one acquires merit by such a work. So this is whether you acquire merit by acting on an invincibly ignorant conscience. Alphonsus says that they almost certainly do acquire merit because the good action is dictated by reason and prudence. As such, it would be done for the glory of God or love of neighbor. A good action done for an evil end would be evil, but an evil action done without knowledge that it's evil for a good purpose would be good, though it would be lacking in certain respects. Then we have an objection from an opponent of this view who thinks that you don't obtain merit by acting on an invincibly ignorant conscience. Good is according to every aspect of an act, and evil comes from any missing part. So this is saying that goodness comes from the totality of an action, not just part of it. But evil comes from just a part. So if the action itself is evil, but the person is invincibly ignorant, then the whole action is evil because the evil comes from just a part. But the response is that this is speaking of a good action considered as a totality as good or evil. However, a good will suffices for the acquisition of merit, for the good will is the only thing that an agent has access to. Whether an invincibly erroneous conscience would be granted in natural precepts. One may be invincibly ignorant of mediate and remote precepts of natural law. So, this is asking, is it possible for people to be invincibly ignorant of the natural law? Is it possible for them to just have no knowledge at all of natural law? And the answer here is that in some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. So there are certain first principles of natural law, such as don't kill an innocent man, which are always evil, and everyone knows it. Everyone has immediate access to this knowledge. However, there are more complicated cases where you have to take the first principles and combine them in certain ways and like run through arguments to come to the true conclusion. Now, a person can't be ignorant, they cannot be ignorant of immediate or first principles, but they can be invincibly ignorant of the mediate or secondary principles. So, like when you have to go through a whole series of arguments to learn something, like not like using contraception is evil, it's possible for you to be invincibly ignorant of the line of argument. You just haven't thought about it, maybe. So in that case, it's possible for someone to use contraception without sinning, even though it would be better if they didn't, and if they knew, it would be a sin for them to use contraception. On someone who erroneously thinks an evil desire is not a sin. So this is about a person who intends an evil, but doesn't actually carry it out because the circumstances forbid him from doing it. And this is asking, if they intend the evil, is it possible for them to be invincibly ignorant of the fact that they shouldn't intend this evil? So if Bob desires to fornicate with Jill and would do so if he got the chance, does he commit any sin simply by intending to fornicate if he thinks the bare intention is not evil? And Alphonsus says that Bob cannot be invincibly ignorant, for he intentionally turns his will away from God in intending to sin if given the chance. And if you intend to do something like that, there's no way you can be ignorant of the fact that you've intentionally turned yourself away from God. Okay, on a confused conscience. A confused conscience is a conscience that finds itself in a no-win scenario. This would be a situation where they think all of their options are grave sins and they don't really know which way to choose. In these situations, people are bound to suspend judgment as long as possible until they can consult with a guide who can be sought, such as a priest or a trustee. If actions must be taken, then the lesser evil must be chosen. If the lesser evil cannot be discerned, no sin is present on account of lack of the freedom of the agent. So this is to say that if the person has two options and they think both options are equally evil, they won't be accountable for choosing the lesser evil because they have no knowledge, and you can only act on knowledge you have. Okay. On a scrupulous conscience and signs of scruples. The scrupulous conscience is a conscience that has an irrational fear of sin. Its signs are refusing to take advice even after seeking it from many people, frequently changing judgments based on very weak motives or reasons, constantly plays through situations over and over, considering different possible versions of the situation, fears sin in all things, even against the judgment of the wise or the judgment of confessors. This is something I added, but I found that scrupulosity is very often connected to anxiety and OCD, because what scrupulosity is this constant questioning of whether your actions that you have taken, are taking, or will take are good or evil, and being unable to settle on a conclusion. I've found this that many scrupulants that I've met turned out to have anxiety or OCD afterward. Okay, remedies and especially acts of obedience. There are many kinds of remedies for scrupulosity. Acts of humility for the scrupulosity is often founded on a kind of pride, thinking that that person is the one that's capable of judging the goodness or evilness of an action, while the priest is totally incapable. Avoiding books and conversations which excite scruples. If your scrupulosity is connected to, say, sexual matters, avoid conversation of those. Become busy with other subjects. Take your mind off the thing you're scrupulous about. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And to commend yourself to God, asking for assistance in obeying your spiritual director and or confessor. On the dangers to the scrupulous who does not obey, this can be a source of sin and increase their scrupulosity. Assigning general rules. Always assign general rules rather than specific rules whenever possible. This is to say that when you assign rules, you should assign rules that are like broad. You shouldn't say like at 2:30 don't drop your pizza on the floor because that's a sin. You should assign like a much more general rule, like make a better attempt to love your family or something like that. The scrupulant should not approach the confessor to ask about the application of these rules constantly, because making the rules more specific is bad for them. How a confessor ought to conduct himself with the scrupulant who is dread to admit any wicked thought. This is a scrupulant who is constantly thinking about that, like they constantly are bombarded by evil thoughts, and they're worried that they're constantly sinning through this. And the response is that they should affirm that bad thoughts are not sins, only consenting to them and indulging them in them is sinful. There are two other kinds of scrupulosity, which he notes here. The second one is scrupulosity about past confessions, that is, thinking that all of your past confessions are probably invalid and that you haven't actually been forgiven of any of your sins. And then scrupulosity about sinning in everything that you do. This is connected to thinking that literally every action you've ever taken and ever will take is sinful. How to deal with those who always doubt their past confessions. Perform a careful general confession with the person and order that past confessions never be brought up again. A general confession is a confession where a person confesses every sin that they can remember in their life up to the point of the confession. And second, if they continue to talk about past confessions during the sacrament, during confession, then withhold the Eucharist from them. Again, this is for priests. I doubt any priests in the modern day are going to do something like that, though, to be honest. How to deal with those who fear to sin in every action. Command him never to speak of anything that he isn't certain is a sin, and to think as little as possible of things that might have been sins in the past. About those who labor with actual fear, this is not to say that a person should actually sin to get rid of scruples. If they are worried that they're actually sinning, if they're certain they're actually sinning, they should avoid the action. And they should only disobey the command of a confessor if an obvious certain sin is present. Otherwise, the scrupulant is not culpable because their conscience is currently shot. It's broken, and they don't have access to whether something is actually a sin or not. And then, the scrupulous do not sin by overcoming scruples, provided that they lay them aside first. The scrupulants should feel free to act in all situations where there is not obvious sin, under the guidance of their confessor's laws. I thought it would be useful to distinguish between two things here at the end here. One is rigorism, and the other one is scrupulosity. Rigorism is having high moral standards, thinking that there are more things that are immoral than most people usually suppose. Scrupulosity is the anxious questioning constantly repeated about whether certain actions, past, present, or future, are sins. Rigorism, I'm probably a rigorist, but I'm not a scrupulant by any means of the imagination, by any stretch of the imagination. And that you can have, because of this, you can have a lax scrupulant, a person who has low standards, but is also scrupulous, who constantly worries about whether they're sinning. That'll be all for this video.